You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Coming to you now live, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. As always, I'll tell you at the top of the show here that the opinions expressed are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. And thank you for joining me here today on Long Waves Radio. I have just been going nuts. I do that a lot anyway. But I've been going especially nuts lately over all the furor in the United States in the lead up to this dog and pony show we call a presidential election. And all of this furor going on. I mean, we've got the whole clown car of Republican candidates who are rapidly going to get weeded out. But in the meantime, there are an endless supply of amusing anecdotes and punchlines and jokes. One of my favorites I heard lately was the slogan for the Trump-Palin campaign, "You're fired, I quit." I like that one, but I've got a strange sense of humor. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about alternatives to neoconservative groupthink that we see arising not only in the U.S., but especially around the world, and how so many of the events that we see make so little sense until you understand how the people who are perpetrating them actually understand the world. And it is a very strange perspective. So we've got all this furor in the U.S. over the upcoming election, but isn't it curious that really the only major candidate in the presidential race who challenges the fundamental central myths of U.S. politics is Bernie Sanders. So you go down the list of the central myths of U.S. politics and U.S. policy. You know, we've got the whole corrupt and unregulated banking industry. We have staggering, stupid, ridiculous amounts of debt at all levels of society. And usually this just means it's another way to screw poor people. We have corporate handouts and loopholes, all of which Mr. Sanders is talking about and is anxious to do away with. We also have the assault on the Constitution and on various freedoms from the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, the EIEIO, and their conspirators in the corporate media. And, of course, the whole issue of money in politics. And I find it interesting that there's only one small voice who's addressing any of these in the presidential issues, and the rest of it is just throwing raw meat to people who've apparently lived on it for the whole of their lives. One of the things I liked about the Bernie Sanders bit was a story in The Onion which said that Sanders beholden to teacher for $300 donation, which kind of brings it down. You look around the world and there are lots of other places where there are these kind of Sanders-esque moments going on when people are seizing power, sometimes through the voting box, often through the voting box. And I want to talk about those a little bit as alternatives. So we have, for instance, Corbyn, who's running for the head of the Labour Party in the UK. And Corbyn's interesting. He's been around even longer than Sanders. He's a teetotaler. He's a vegetarian. He's never been particularly oppositional or a troublemaker or anything like this. And the smart money says he was sort of allowed to run. he was nominated by enough members of parliament that he could get on the ticket as the leader, enough members of the party, and it was basically so there'd be some kind of lefty for the debates, that the party could deal with. But what's happening is that stacks and stacks of people are suddenly joining the labor movement and are very much interested in this gentleman from near London, Mr. Corbyn. And he's proposing a whole range of changes, which are rollbacks of a lot of the damage that's been done since Reagan and Thatcher, that whole neoconservative movement to corporatize everything and eliminate all protections, all social programs for people, and meanwhile degrade the economy so that people stay poor. So what is this lunatic Corbyn calling for in the UK? Well, he wants to end fees for universities. You have no idea. That's actually a terribly popular thing in the UK. He wants to place rent controls on private houses and have rent to own, much more common in private housing in the UK. He doesn't want to upgrade the Trident nuclear missiles, the submarine-launched ballistic missiles that the Brits buy from us from time to time. He's anti-austerity, and he sees the wisdom of government control of some activities, some economic activities. You may recall that the railroads and the energy industry in the UK were national at one time, and then they were sold off to private industry. And really, virtually nobody thinks that worked well. And he wants to renationalize the railroads and the energy industry. I mean, think about it. You've got an essential industry. It makes sense for the government to control it. For one thing, you get these marvelous economies of scale. There's no profit to be made, so it can actually be a lot cheaper, and it can be wonderfully efficient if it's done well. So many of the inefficiencies in government are not the fault of the idea. They're the fault of what's added on to the idea later. So we have Bernie Sanders in the U.S., we have Corbyn in the UK, we have all kinds of people kicking around and having all kinds of interesting ideas about how the world should work. And particularly in South America, we see some very interesting politics going on. And we also see some very interesting politics in Turkey and the Middle East. So I'll be getting into all of those today. But to open this, to give it a sort of perspective, I want to make reference to a new book, which I don't have yet, but I will, which has been reviewed. And it's a book by a gentleman named Andrew Korybko, who writes for Sputnik as well as some other places. And it was reviewed in the orientalreview.org. His book is called Hybrid Wars, the Indirect Adaptive Approach to Regime Change. So the Russian Diplomatic Academy reviewed the book and had it released. So Mr. Korybko is a member of the Expert Council of the Institute for Strategic Research and Predictions. And what he looks at in this book are the color revolutions, the color revolutions in Ukraine and in Georgia and in the Middle East. The thesis of his book, then, is that these are, in fact, a new form of warfare engineered by the United States. And I've talked about this idea on the show before, but apparently he has a rather good book on it. So the color revolutions, quote, are a new form of warfare engineered by the U.S. with everything from their organizational makeup to geopolitical application being guided by American strategists. But unlike earlier researchers who've touched upon the topic, Andrew takes his work even further and uses the latest examples of the war in Syria and the Euromaidan, that would be Ukraine, to argue that the U.S. has deployed a second, more dangerous step to its regime change toolkit. Now, we all know the U.S. is all about the regime change. Somebody gets over there who the corporations don't like, somebody gets elected anywhere who the corporations don't like, or the fascists don't like, or the neocons don't like, or somebody's brother doesn't like, then it's time for a regime change. And after, some 60 years of doing this, we've gotten rather good at it, if I say so myself. So, back to the review. Hybrid wars are when the U.S. meshes its color revolution and unconventional warfare strategies together to create a unified toolkit for carrying out regime change in targeted states. When a color revolution attempt fails, as it did miserably in Syria in 2011, the backup plan is to roll out an unconventional war that builds directly upon the former's social infrastructure and organizing methods. In the case of Euromaidan, Andrew cites Western news sources such as Newsweek magazine, The Guardian, and Reuters in reminding everyone that in the days immediately prior to the coup's successful completion, Western Ukraine was in full-scale rebellion against the central government, and the stage was set for an unconventional Syrian-esque war in the heart of Eastern Europe. Had it not been for the sudden overthrow of President Yanukovych, the U.S. was prepared to take the country down the path of the Syrian scenario, which would have been its second full-fledged application of hybrid war. This makes a sort of sense. If your color revolution doesn't fail, you send the National Endowment for the Democracies and all of the other alphabet soup of organizations that are designed to train people in organizing, to organize people, to give them tactics, to give them financial support so they can go have a protest in the streets and they can go out and march and demonstrate. And if that doesn't sufficiently bring about the revolution you're seeking, well, then you just double down and use a lot of these same people to organize a full-scale rebellion, as we saw the Azov battalion and some of the other Nazi groups being organized and then deployed in Ukraine, where they would seize government buildings with weaponry, where they would murder opposition people. Some 40 or 50 people were burned or shot in a government building when they were chased in, and they were supporters of the Yanukovych regime. And this was widespread. Similarly, the allegations of government or police snipers shooting people have been seriously challenged, with the suggestion and some evidence that it was in fact these Nazis in Ukraine who were shooting both sides, both the government and the protesters, government people, police and such, and the protesters, to show, just to make it more out of control, and then say it was the government doing it. So that's how it worked. The same thing happened in Syria, as you recall. Remember the government snipers who were killing all those people in the streets? And it emerged that, maybe it wasn't government snipers, maybe it was other people. There was some evidence in those directions, and we've seen other kinds of false flags. For instance, we saw the alleged use of nerve gas in some badly homemade rockets that the government had apparently fired. We hear talk about barrel bombs being dropped every day, and almost always those are either aircraft from Turkey, or they are ISIS using artillery and things such as this. But you can hide it all. Just keep the press, which are only too happy to keep running the stories, The Guardian, the New York Times, the BBC, Time magazine, only too happy to keep singing the government song about the evils of whatever government it is you're trying to destroy, whether it was the Yanukovych government in Ukraine or whether it was Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Continuing the review, Andrew's revolutionary research ultimately shows that it was the U.S., not Russia, which spearheaded the use of hybrid wars, and that given his findings, it's irresponsible to call Russia's alleged involvement in the Ukrainian crisis a hybrid war. In fact, the U.S. is far ahead of any other country in practicing this new method of warfare, as no other state has attempted a color revolution thus far, let alone transitioned it into an unconventional war when their initial regime change plans fail. Excuse me. While many think that such occurrences are spontaneous and happenstance, Andrew documents how hybrid wars are not only created from the ground up by the U.S., but how they're specifically deployed in areas where they'd be the most geostrategically advantageous for the promotion of unipolar policies. I don't think I can say that 3 times real fast. But one of the really clever ideas that Krupko comes out with is this idea of a color arc, which he described as a contiguous line of states stretching from Hungary to Kyrgyzstan, and where the waging of hybrid wars would most seriously damage Russia's national interests. So if we look at these color revolutions and where the U.S. has pulled them off, certainly there is an argument to be made that these are attempts to foster either unstable countries or U.S. favorable governments, however totalitarian they might be, along this huge arc. And this is sort of a paradigm change, but it does explain a great deal of what the U.S. is doing. It really does. So, we also see that people in other parts of the world are getting wise to some of these games. They're just not so keen on playing the same kind of games the U.S. has been attempting to pull off, particularly the Argentine government has issued some rather harsh statements about El Norte, the up north folk, that would be us. This is from Telesur, 26 August 2015. The Argentine government claimed Tuesday that foreign actors from up north, that is the U.S., played a role in organizing opposition demonstrations against alleged fraud in the country's recent local elections. Argentina's cabinet chief, Anibal Fernandez, told reporters that, quote, the actions of the North seek to delegitimate the general elections scheduled to take place later this year. Well, it sounds like the plan. His comments followed an incident that occurred in the provincial capital of Tucumán, in which local police responded to protesters by firing tear gas and rubber bullets. The incident, which resulted in dozens of injuries, has been widely condemned by Argentine political officials. Fernandez said, quote, I condemn repressive acts under any circumstances. Argentine presidential candidate Daniel Scioli from the ruling Victory Party front denounced the heavy-handed response, as well as, quote, the authoritarian attitude shown by some police officers. Meanwhile, Argentine prosecutors have issued legal charges against police chief Jose Dante Bustamante for his role in Monday's incident. So, you can see how this works. If you use NED or one of the other of the alphabet soup of CIA operations that call themselves NGOs, which they're certainly not, but they call themselves that, and they go in and they organize an opposition, and there's always an opposition. There are always people who want to take the folks out of power and get power themselves. And if you can find the people who would be favorable to U.S. interests to put into key places, as the U.S. did in Ukraine, as the U.S. did in Chile and Colombia and Argentina, and on and on and on and on and on, well, then it's in the interests of the powers that be in the U.S. who believe the U.S. should control the world to do this. So, in recent weeks, in Ecuador, the Ecuadorian opposition has been staging protests around President Rafael Correa's government. Originally, they started off complaining about two tax laws that the government was proposing, and the government said, okay, well, we'll delay the laws and we'll open debate about the laws. Well, and then, of course, the opposition says, well, it's not about those laws. It's about corruption, and it's rah, which is, you can't argue with people who keep shifting the terms of the debate. According to Telesur, again, protests have often turned violent, although no major injuries or deaths have been registered. This, again, is in Ecuador. However, there is a common trait to all of them. Opposition demonstrators are seeking to provoke a confrontation with government supporters. This, my dear listeners, is classic color revolution stuff. You get a gang, you have them go out and you confront the other side and try to turn it into something violent. In striking difference, back to Telesur, in striking difference to other countries, protests in Ecuador can change their route and are not required to have previous authorization by law enforcement officials. My God, what's wrong with this country? That does sound repressive, doesn't it? You can change your route whenever you want, and you're not required to actually be authorized to have a protest. Wow. This has paved the way for the opposition to launch caravans and lengthy marches which begin in one place and unexpectedly change their destination. The strategy has been constantly denounced by the government ever since May 1st. Marches. President Correa has warned the local opposition is emulating tactics seen in Venezuela in April 2015, and the president had a prediction about this. Quote, I can anticipate the opposition's strategy. Mobilizations, provocations, victimizations. Oh, goodness, doesn't that sound like Ukraine? Doesn't that sound like Egypt? Doesn't that sound like Georgia? Doesn't that sound like a lot of the color revolutions we've seen? That's the strategy for the protests. That's your beginning strategy after you've organized. Mobilize, provoke, establish yourself as victims. Telesur notes that Correa's denunciation was not far-fetched. Quote, in early July, Ecuadorian intelligence officers uncovered a coup plot that sought to deliberately provoke clashes between opposition demonstrators, state security forces, and government supporters near the presidential palace. In 2002, the coup in Venezuela, which ousted former President Hugo Chavez for 48 hours, began after an anti-government march attempted to reach another pro-government rally close to Miraflores presidential palace, prompting clashes. The most recent round of protests in Ecuador began when President Correa left for Brussels in early June to attend the EU CELAC summit. In similar fashion, a fresh round of protests in Venezuela broke out in January when President Nicolas Maduro left for an international tour to Russia, Algeria, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, seeking more stability in oil prices. You want more evidence? Here we go. Furthermore, on June 24th, 2015, the president of Venezuela's parliament, Diosdado Cabello, revealed that political consultant Armando Briquet who is also a senior member of a far-right party, Justice First, in Venezuela, was working closely with the Ecuadorian opposition. So we've got organization across national lines. So you can see how this works, and you can see how it plays out. So, for example, we can look at Colombia. Again, this is Telesur. Ever since leaving office, former Colombian president, now Senator Álvaro Uribe, vowed to fight the late President Chavez. This apparently applies to Chavez's legacy in the region, as Uribe has proudly admitted that he would work as an advisor to the Venezuelan and Ecuadorian oppositions. During Ecuador's general elections campaign in 2012, President Correa warned that the opposition was holding weekly meetings with Uribe, who was helping them. President Correa has singled out as a key figure Colonel Mario Pazmiño, who was in charge of the Army's intelligence when Colombian troops, commanded by President Uribe, illegally entered Ecuador through the border of Angostura in a raid against guerrilla fighters in 2008. So we can see how this works. But, you know, when the simple calls to, oh, you know, we can do better than this government, when these don't work, then you've got to look for the other kinds of cat calls that'll get folks riled up. And Telesur gives us a nice little list of them. Violence. Oh, they're using violence. Look, because one police chief in one province in one city overreacted. Okay. Corruption. They're corrupt. Drug trafficking, delinquency, dictatorship. Quote, these are the flags that both opposition groups are using to call for protests. The 2014 protests in Venezuela that led to the death of 43 people, mostly government supporters, began as a demand by students to have more safety in their universities' campuses. Soon they snowballed into delinquency, corruption, lack of democracy, and anything else that could spark anger. This is exactly how color revolutions work. Today, the same discourse is used in Ecuador. A new campaign entitled Let Him Not Rule presents 3 videos which portray the alleged insecurity in the country, widespread injustice, and corruption. And everyone knows videos can't lie. So, recent protests have used similar discourse to the Venezuelan opposition, referring repeatedly to Correa as a dictator, chanting for freedom, and even now one group is talking about La Salida, just as the violent opposition barricaders called for earlier last year. Well, here's the bit. Right? In Colombia and in Ecuador, you know, all those WikiLeaks cables, there are actually people who read those, and these do show up in newspapers and news organizations in countries where they have good news organizations. The WikiLeaks cables show that those who are heading today's protests in Ecuador are closely linked to U.S. government and intelligence services. Pazmiño is described in leaked cables as close to the CIA and the former Colombian intelligence service, DAS. Now remember, this is an Ecuadorian who's close to the Colombian intelligence service and the CIA. The DAS was particularly infiltrated with paramilitary elements during Álvaro Uribe's presidency. At the time, Pazmiño was head of the Ecuadorian military intelligence. Guillermo Lasso, former Minister of Economy, and one of the politicians backing recent protests, is also shown in the U.S. cables, meeting with U.S. Embassy in Quito to provide them information and his personal advice on current issues. Probably where the good restaurants are. The U.S. cables also show that Washington reached out to help Paez to help fight oil giant Chevron after the company was blamed for a massive oil spill in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Paez has been publicly leading efforts in support of the oil company. So, put it all together, and we have this. There are active, ongoing attempts of the U.S. to use this color strategy throughout Latin America, and it's happening all the time. These hybrid wars, and not just there, but everywhere else. So, what do we see in South America? Carrera, quoting Telesur again, Carrera has put forward the theory that violence is being deliberately employed in order to provoke response from security officials in order to accuse the government of having violated civil rights in order to invite foreign intervention in the form of sanctions, as was done to Venezuela earlier this year when the U.S. government labeled Venezuela as a threat to its national security. And you may recall I covered that on this show. President Carrera has warned that coups are still a very real threat in the region, and violent street protests are part of a coordinated and deliberate campaign by right-wing forces in the region to destabilize the progressive and revolutionary governments of Latin America. That's what they say. So, golly gosh. If we turn our eyes elsewhere for a few moments here, if I can get everything sorted out, which is kind of unlikely, truly, we could look at, say, the neo-Nazis in Ukraine and how these people with military training, these people with openly fascist viewpoints, these people with no interest whatsoever in democracy or anything remotely approaching it, got pulled in to become basically the SA, the brown shirts of the Maidan movement. And these were the ones I mentioned earlier who were murdering people and burning buildings and such. I mean, these are people that even the U.S. House of Representatives called Nazis, right? Back in February last year, when ethnic Russian rebels, it was this year, when ethnic Russian rebels were closing in on the Ukrainian port of Mariupol, the New York Times is going on, right? New York Times is going on about the heroes defending Western civilization, the courageous Azov battalion fighting down these ethnic people. And these heroes were, in fact, as I've said, Nazis. Some of them even wear swastikas and SS symbols on their uniforms and carry flags with swastikas and SS uniforms, the Nazi Wolfsangel, on their uniforms and on banners. So, you had a long Times article by Rick Lyman, which just turned into the kind of political propagandistic blather that the Times is becoming increasingly famous for. Didn't even mention the Azov battalion as Nazis. But as Robert Perry remarked, when even the hawkish House of Representatives can't stomach these Nazi stormtroopers who have served as Kiev's tip of the spear against the ethnic Russian population of eastern Ukraine, what does that say about the honesty and integrity of the New York Times when it finds these same Nazis so admirable? June 10th, U.S. House of Representatives approved a bipartisan amendment to the Defense Appropriations Act from Representatives John Conyers and Ted Yoho that would block U.S. training of the Azov Battalion and would prevent transfer of shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles to fighters in Iraq and Ukraine. Gee, thank heavens they did that. Thank heavens they did that. Conyers gave a statement that I'm grateful that the House of Representatives unanimously passed my amendments last night to ensure that our military does not train members of the repulsive neo-Nazi Azov Battalion, along with my measures to keep dangerous and easily trafficked man-pads, right? Those are those little portable ground-air missiles, out of these unstable regions. I mean, really, you do not want these people coming around and getting easy access to shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons, especially not since we now have Islamist extremists who have joined with Azov and with Ukrainian elements, 3 battalions of them, no less, who have wandered up there to eastern Ukraine to fight with Azov. This was actually reported by the New York Times. I was just bad-mouthing them. Occasionally they find themselves forced to reveal truth. But they cited 3 volunteer battalions heading up to Mariupol with heavy weaponry, tanks, howitzers, cannons. 3 battalions, that's not a small number, and they're going to go up there and do one of 2 things. Either they're going to reinforce the region to prevent the Russian separatists or the Ukrainian-Russian separatists from gaining ground, which they have shown no interest in doing, or the Ukraine is in fact planning, or the Ukraine is in fact planning an invasion, a serious counteroffensive against the rebels in that part of the region. So that seems to me just generally a lot more likely than what's being reported. I just can't see them going up there to hang out. But let us then turn our eyes to, well, we could go a lot of places. Let's talk for a moment about the bombing in Thailand. I know you probably saw that made the news. There was a small bomb went off in Thailand, and it was who did it? Well, at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, just in the last day or so, Anthony Davis, who was speaking on a Foreign Correspondents Club panel, he's a military analyst with Janes, which is one of the sterling military analytic and political analytic organizations. They don't always get it right, but they generally do their homework, and they have good people who work for them. Anyway, Anthony Davis conclusively, according to Forbes magazine, implicated a group called the Grey Wolves. Grey Wolves are a terror group from Turkey. Why would a terror group from Turkey attack Thailand? I hear you ask. That's a very good question. And really there are only 2 things that make sense. If the one is that, which is the one that Forbes presented, is that the Grey Wolves were incensed, mind you, that Thailand had refused to block the repatriation of some Uyghurs back to China. Okay, that's the kind of things they could get upset about. But there are other people, the ones who don't get cited in the New York Times, but nonetheless have some credibility, who refer to the Grey Wolves as basically as having been one of those groups that the U.S. and NATO have used periodically and have basically run out of the embassy in Ankara, Turkey. Now, I have no good evidence of this at this time, but it's something I'm going to dig into, and one of the sources I'm going to be going to would be Sibel Edmonds, who is wonderful on all things Turkish. She was an FBI translator for a long time before she found out things no one wanted her to talk about. But just to remind you, these guys have been around for a while. They have their own Wikipedia page. You can look them up, Grey Wolves. But you remember back in 1981 when Pope John Paul II was shot by Agsa? You know, I think he was Turkish or Bulgarian or whatever. Anyway, Agsa was a member of the Grey Wolves. He was indeed. So there are lots of things they get upset about, and periodically they have these acts of violence. And, you know, given what we know, it is not completely out of the realm of possibility that the Grey Wolves could be one of those covert groups like ISIS that the U.S. has some control over. And they could run them out to a place like Thailand, just to remind them that, you know, you want to play ball with us. You don't want to sidle up to China just now. You want to kind of play ball with the West here, because bad things can happen. You don't want me to send an enforcer around now, do you? So, well then. But let's go on and see how this game plays out in Syria. There's all kinds of interesting things going on in Syria right now. One of them is some very good descriptions of what's going on with Erdogan, who is the titular head of Turkey. Well, let me just read you some of this. This is from William F. Engdahl. And Engdahl points out that more and more details, quote, are coming to light, revealing that the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, variously known as ISIS, IS, or Daesh, is being fed and kept alive by Erdogan, the Turkish president, and his Turkish intelligence service, including the MIT, which is the Turkish CIA. Turkey, as a result of Erdogan's pursuit of what some call a neo-Ottoman empire fantasies that stretch all the way to China, Syria, and Iraq, threatens not only to destroy much of the Middle East, but Turkey if it continues on its present path. In 2014, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden told a Harvard gathering that Erdogan's regime was backing ISIS with, quote, hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons. This is the U.S. Vice President, said this in October of 2014. And remember, Turkey is a NATO nation. That makes them one of our buddies. Biden later apologized, clearly for tactical reasons, to get Erdogan's permission to use Turkey's Incirlik airbase for airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. But the dimensions of Erdogan's backing for the U.S. sense is far, far more than Biden hinted. ISIS militants were trained by U.S., Israeli, and now it emerges by Turkish special forces at secret bases in Konya province inside the Turkish border to Syria over the past 3 years. Erdogan's involvement in ISIS goes much deeper. At a time when Washington, Saudi Arabia, and even Qatar appear to have cut off their support for ISIS, they remain amazingly durable. The reason appears to be the scale of backing from Erdogan and his fellow neo-Ottoman Sunni Islam Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu. or some approximation of those sounds. So how does this work? Well, one of the things you do is you get your son involved. So Erdogan's son, Bilal, apparently is involved in illegal and lucrative oil trading for ISIS, in that he takes oil from the captured oil fields that ISIS extracts, and he sells it on for them and launders the money, basically. Meh. So, what we have going on here is that Erdogan, this is according to another geopolitical analyst who I do follow sometimes, Thierry Meyssan, that Erdogan, quote, organized the pillage of Syria, dismantled all the factories in Aleppo, the economic capital, and stole the machine tools. Similarly, he organized the theft of archaeological treasures and set up an international market in Antioch, with the help of General Benoit Puga, chief of staff for the Élysée. He organized a false flag operation intended to provoke the launching of a war by the Atlantic Alliance, the chemical bombing of La Ghouta in Damascus in August 2013. So this is our good friend Erdogan. And I have a lot of time for William Engdahl. He does very good work, and he has very good sources. So our good friends and we are training ISIS, funding ISIS, laundering ISIS's money as part of this, well, let's call it what it is. It's a mercenary army to take down Syria because the color revolution failed. And notice, the U.S. doesn't send troops in. The British don't send troops in. We'll fly planes over and bomb civilians primarily, but we're not actually going to put troops on the ground, not as long as we can get militant armies. Now, whether anybody stops to think about what happens after these armies have done their business and destroyed the country, I have no idea. But given the kind of groupthink in Washington, given the kind of what all the smart people know and understand and believe, you got to understand just how encapsulated Washington is. And this is one of the big problems with our foreign policy, is all of these people, they all want to sound like they're in the know. They all want to sound like they're part of the power structure. So you've got to use the right words and the right phrases and have the right ideas. But it doesn't mean you actually have to consider what the outcomes are. You're just there to make it happen, right? You're just there to make it happen. There was another interesting statement released just the other day called Syria, the last bastion standing in ISIL's way. And this was some representatives of a French party, but it's a rather thoughtful little piece, and I would just read you a few bits. Some have accused Bashar Assad of being a dictator, assigning him the blame for the blood which has been spilled in Syria and calling him an enemy of the West. As with Iran, Venezuela, or Russia, Syria has unjustifiably become a victim of the West's contempt which can be explained only by Syria's refusal to submit to Atlanticist tutelage. Despite numerous criticisms regularly appearing against the Syrian Republic, Bashar al-Assad's Syria today is actually the last bulwark against Daesh, facing the relentless rise of a vast Islamic state advocating the purest form of Sharia law, the antithesis of the so-called values espoused by the state. Assad has the support of most of his people and will remain democratically legitimate president of the Syrian state until 2021. If the head of the Syrian state were truly as isolated as Western media depicts, how has he been able to stay in power through a crisis lasting over 4 years? And the article goes on to point out he's not a bloodthirsty dictator. He's not an enemy of the West. He's, in fact, a wartime president, trying to serve his people and his country. So, while the Islamic State, reading again, while the Islamic State continues to attract terrorists from around the world, creating a virtually inexhaustible army, the international community condemns the existence of this self-proclaimed state, while the Syrian opposition consists only of Islamists. France, which was once an ardently independent state, must once again find its pedigree and reverse its position on the Syrian issue. Syria is a nationalist, secular, and multicultural state. It is a sovereign nation in which women are free and Christians are protected. It is worth recalling that before the foreign intervention, Syria was one of the only a few Arab countries which saw demographic growth among its Christian community. It's also worth recalling that after American intervention in Iraq, nearly 90% of Iraq's Christians were killed or fled the country. Neither Bashar al-Assad nor Saddam Hussein were responsible for the extermination of Middle East Christians. This genocide was accentuated by the West's interference, and especially that of the U.S. in this region of the world. This interference is illustrated not only through the military interventions, as in Iraq or Libya, but also through active support for the Islamists, called rebels by our media. Who is responsible for funding the Syrian opposition? The West. Who is the Syrian opposition? Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria. And ISIS, you will recall, is a branch of Al-Nusra. And so it goes. Meanwhile, Russia's been running around busily trying to put together political solutions to this matter. And apparently, according to some reports I read, they have been keeping the U.S. on the loop on some of these issues, especially on the issue of beginning to provide intelligence in the form of real-time satellite intel on movements of ISIS units to the Syrian government. And it is said that NATO was doing this for ISIS for quite a while. To Damascus also, some MiG-31s have been delivered, some very good interceptors. There are military advisors now Russian military advisors now in Syria. And the Russian army is supplying satellite images, which really gives them a toe up. So apparently it seems that NATO is no longer supplying ISIS with satellite pictures of the Syrian army. And I know that's got to come as a bit of a shock to them. So you see how the game plays out. We see all the levels of it. We see the level of the color revolution, and then we see the level of the escalation of it into violent protests. And if you don't have sufficient numbers of mercenaries and paid killers and thugs on your team to actually bring down a government, then you just bring in more paid mercenaries, like ISIS or Daesh or the Chechens or the Azovs. You just bring in more of these clowns until you bring about the overthrow and destruction of a country. The overthrow of a country. And this is the best I can figure out what's going on in the Middle East today. There's some other points I would love to be able to make to you today, but I think I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to have to cut all of this a little bit short. But perhaps one thing, I'm not fond of quoting Henry Kissinger. I'm really not. He's not one of my favorite people. But Kissinger had a lovely comment in a recent interview about how the U.S. gets into these things and how it can't get out. And Kissinger said, "The trouble with America's wars since the end of the Second World War has been the failure to relate strategy to what is possible domestically. The 5 wars we've fought since the end of World War II were all started with great enthusiasm, but the hawks did not prevail in the end. At the end, they were a minority. We should not engage in international conflicts if at the beginning we cannot describe an end, and if we're not willing to sustain the effort to achieve that end. The issue is not to extricate the United States from the Ukrainian impasse, but to solve it in a way conducive to international order." And again, I don't like quoting Henry Kissinger. I don't like the man. I don't like his policies. But, like Pat Buchanan, when he gets it right, he gets it right. Anyway, our problem in a large part is that even a leader, so-called, like President Obama, has trouble stepping out of the groupthink, because then you're just talking nonsense and people think you're crazy. Well, I'm going to conclude today's show here, but I do want to remind you that if you want to help us out at KYRS, and we've got a fund drive coming up here in September, but if you want to help us out in KYRS, if you've got an old car, an old truck, old motorcycle, whatever, you can donate it to us. All you have to do is call. We'll arrange to have it picked up. You sign the form transferring the ownership, and you get a tax receipt. So an old clunker that doesn't run, something that you've been saying you're going to fix up, and you're never going to. You know you're not. There's a chance to do something good, get the thing off of your yard, and help us out at KYRS. Now, I'll tell you how you do this. It's really simple. You call 855-597-7227. We'll arrange for a free pickup to come and get it. So 855-KYRS-CAR. Thank you for listening. I've enjoyed today's show. I hope you found something in it of amusement and interest. I'll be back next week. I will have a Nope, that's not true. I'm going to be gone for a while, but it won't be next week. Anyway, so I will be back next week with another show. Write me, longwaves at kyrs.org. Facebook is Longwaves Radio, and find podcasts on YouTube. So, until next week, stay safe, stay smart, stay strong. And let me remind you one last time, you're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Have a great week, and think about what I was saying. Bye now.